There are many dimensions found throughout the My Singing Monsters multiverse, and today we're going to go over how all of the dimensions interconnect with one another. Please do make sure to leave a like and to subscribe before we begin. All of the dimensions inside of the My Singing Monsters multiverse reside on the World Tree. This is called the Stablo Mjehurića. The Stablo Mjehurića sits all of the dimensions on top of their branches. So essentially, if you imagine a huge tree and all of the different dimensions that exist inside of the My Singing Monsters multiverse being at the end tips of the branches of a tree, that is essentially what encapsulates all of the My Singing Monsters dimensions that we know about. The Stablo Mjehurića is a very important piece towards the lore, as is pretty much everything that we've been over, but this one is where everything interlinks with one another. The pocket dimension, which we went over on our previous episode, the Prism dimension that we went over in the Titans episode when we were on about Phosphor, this is where it all encapsulates and sort of just comes together, as this is essentially what makes the My Singing Monsters multiverse tick. This is the very location where we see all of the dimensions existing amongst one another and their exact location towards each other. The Stablo Mjehurića has several properties. First of all, it is involved in the process of amber. Amber we see throughout the My Singing Monsters multiverse absolutely everywhere. We see it when Cain has been awoken on Tribal Island, we see it with the ambered thing, the freed thing, and we see it in a lot of places, and we even see it in different dimensions that we're going to go into later, so that it's a very essential role. The Stablo Mjehurića plays into amber, as amber is a sap from this world tree. Essentially, if you're imagining the Stablo Mjehurića once again, the little drips that fall from the Stablo Mjehurića are what form amber in the first place, and this amber has been shown to influence different dimensions in different places. We're not going to go specifically too far deep into amber, as there's so much to cover today already. However, with amber, I think it's a really good theory to make that, seen as though amber is sap coming from the world tree, that this could be coming from branches from the world tree and dripping into the different dimensions. Seen as though all the different dimensions exist on top of one another, essentially, with them being branches, and it's likely that they're in positions whereby sap could easily fall into them. I think this is a very easy solution as towards how amber is created in the first place. There's so many theories towards how amber could be created inside of the My Singing Monsters multiverse, though, and I don't really want to go too far deep into it, but seeing as though we've been on about the World Tree, I think that's a very good theory to put out there. The World Tree has a huge amount of energy, and this is proved by how the Colossals are able to draw upon it, and how the Colossals were able to bring about the Prime Reality's existence inside of the Dawn of Fire, as we went over in our first episode in the first place. Now, the Great Song was allowed to take place thanks to the Stablo Mjehurića. When the Colossals were performing the Great Song after they'd done all their experiments in the pocket dimension, as we went over last time, and they'd managed to find a way to bring the monsters to life in the first place when there was nothing there and they were just trying to bring this world to life, they managed to empower themselves to be able to conduct the Great Song thanks to the massive, overwhelming power of the World Tree. Seen as though the World Tree has such a huge amount of power, it makes such a large amount of sense that this indeed is the main basis of where power comes from inside of the My Singing Monsters multiverse. So essentially, you can imagine that most of the things that go off involving energy inside of the monster world is tied to the World Tree. And this is something that is tied to many other lore places that we've not actually been over and we will likely go over in future episodes. So that's a very key point I'd like you to remember from today's episode. Unfortunately, the Stablo Mjehurića exists inside of an unknown location as of right now and an unknown dimension. However, seen as though it's essentially where all the dimensions and where the My Singing Monsters multiverse comes together in its entirety, it makes a lot of sense that it is in somewhat of the center of the My Singing Monsters multiverse. Just imagine it basically encapsulating all of them. We don't know, unfortunately, which dimension it resides in, if it's in fact a part of its own dimension. We've seen monsters travel from dimensions to dimension, and we've not seen the World Tree in that instance, for example, in the Summer Song trailer, in the Magical Sanctum trailer. However, the exact way in which you can travel over to the Stablo Mjehurića is something, unfortunately, that we don't know too much about, and is something that I'd love to know more about, hopefully sometime in the future. You would guess that upon traveling between dimensions, seen as though the World Tree is essentially the thing holding all the dimensions, that you'd see the World Tree, but the location in which you are actually going to when venturing across different dimensions is something that we're going to go into in next week's episode. But for right now, seen as though it isn't the case that we don't see the World Tree upon travel between dimensions, it actually does insist that no one has actually ventured to the World Tree as of yet from the Prime Reality, or in fact any of the dimensions dimensions, and that potentially the Colossals are the only one who have actually ventured to it, and whether they have or if they haven't is something that we don't really know too much about. Seeing as though they have drawn up energy, however, from it, they do seem to have much more of a clearer picture of what it is over everything that we do know. Just like to most of the lore, to be honest, the Colossals seem to be the answer. The tree's origins, unfortunately, are unknown, and we don't know how exactly dimensions are created in the first instance on the World Tree. We know that dimensions such as Thingia that we are going to go on to later actually came before the Prime Reality, the main dimension of the My Singing Monsters multiverse. So seeing as though we know that different dimensions existed before the Prime Reality and the dawn of fire and everything, there does seem to be a reasonable theory here that dimensions do grow inside of this tree and they can be created by the Stablo Mjehurića, as otherwise there would be no way in which that the dimensions in the first place could be formed before one another or after one another. So seeing as though that takes place, it does seem to suggest that dimensions are created in some way. We know the way in which the Colossals made the monsters and managed to bring about the dawn of fire, as we went over last time. However, seeing as though there's not much information here, we don't know anything about this process, and I think this is probably something inside of the lore which I just really want to know more about. The exact way in which dimensions are created, I think, is a phenomenal thing which we could delve deeper into, so hopefully that's something else that we can look into inside of the future. So what dimension sits on the Stablo Mjehurića then? Well, first of all, we have the Thumpiesverse, and we've got a lovely carousel on screen now showing all of the different dimensions that exist on the Stablo Mjehurića. So let's venture into the Thumpiesverse first. So the Thumpiesverse is where the Thumpies originate from. It's a dimension in which we have the Great Tree, which is a huge tree landmark inside of the Thumpiesverse, and we have several levels and different locations that we find inside of the Thumpiesverse. It's where the Thumpies game initially took place. This is where the Thumpies originated, as we've been over, so all of the Thumpies that are inside of the Prime Reality are the ones that we see inside of the Thumpiesverse, and somehow these Thumpies have managed to venture across from the Thumpiesverse into the Prime Reality. And we see this with the decorations too, as we've seen the Thumpies totems which reference the different Thumpies. Maybe these are made in inspiration from the Thumpiesverse, or maybe these insist that different Thumpies have visited even more so than the ones that we already know about. We also know that not only have the Thumpies ventured into the Prime Reality, but the Thumpies have also fled into the Prism Gate for some too. We've seen with the yellow Thumpies, Mosh, one of the Thumpies, venture into the Prism Gate with that one. We've seen several Thumpies, none of which are actually referenced inside of the Thumpies game, actually be a part of the prismatic forms, therefore insisting that not only have the Thumpies ventured into the Prime Reality, but also the Prism dimension as seen with the Prism Gate and all of the prismatic Thumpies variant. For all of the Thumpies then, we have different types and different names to go over. So first of all, we have Newbie and Furface, who are based on the common Thumpies, Rort and Reese's, who are based on rare Thumpies, Gooey, Cheshire, Chomp, Flippy, Boo, Anyanka, Squee, Cal, Tawoo, Roots, who's based on epic Thumpies, Izzit, who was also based on epic Thumpies, Mosh, who's based on yellow prismatic Thumpies, Yuckles, Gorg, Portu, and Mace, probably being the most arrogant looking of them all. Not only do we have all of the different types that exist inside of the Thumpiesverse that we've been over now, but we also have the ones which actually aren't found inside of the Thumpies game that are found with the prismatic forms. So we have Woot, Scoot, T8, Lynn, John, Mumsy, Frankie, Scoot, Bangers, Mosh, Tumble, Rough, Amth, and Goth, with Mosh being the only one which actually is from the original Thumpies game out of all of those prismatic variants there, perhaps hinting towards a larger roster of Thumpies creatures than what we may have guessed from the Thumpies game. With all of these Thumpies, we also have the elemental symbols that are tied towards the Great Tree. Before we do go into these elemental symbols that are tied towards the Great Tree that we see upon entering different locations from the Great Tree, that kind of just sprout out from the Great Tree in different areas from inside of the Thumpiesverse, I do want to go over what the Great Tree is. The Great Tree was created from sap that came off of the Stablo Mjehurića. So the Thumpiesverse is essentially grounded upon a realm in which the Stablo Mjehurića is created. We know that the Colossals did help inside of the Prime Reality, so maybe this is also hinting towards the Stablo Mjehurića having a much greater influence inside of the different dimensions than what we particularly know about, especially for the dimensions that we don't know too much about. When we go into the next one, I think that will also make you understand my theory on this a little bit better, as we do have a bit more information on the Stablo Mjehurića's influence inside of that dimension too. For the different symbols that we have that are tied towards the Great Tree, we see these across all of the different islands inside of the Prime Reality. We see it with the mythicals, as we have the mythical symbol that is tied towards the Great Tree, that's tied to one of the levels. We also have the Ethereal Island Path symbols that are seen on Epic Pummel and the Wubbox Stockpile. Those are all symbols that originate from the Thumpiesverse. These are not symbols that originally came from the Prime Reality. Whether this is because of the Thumpiesverse being older, we don't know the exact time frame for the Thumpiesverse when it was created, unfortunately. That is an unknown conclusion to make. However, it seems as though the monsters were influenced in some way by the Thumpiesverse, going by these elemental links here, and now we know they originate from the Thumpiesverse. Seen as though we've had all the Thumpies venture across into the Prime Reality, this also does confirm that transportation between the Thumpiesverse and the Prime Reality is possible between these two dimensions, perhaps insisting too that dimensional travel is possible between the other dimensions that we are going to go over. We've just been over how there's signs of interdimensional travel going on, and inside of Thingia, this is where all of these signs start really coming together. Inside of Thingia, we have various different locations. Rather than the Thumpiesverse, where they're much more obscure, the names and locations behind things, we have specific names for Thingia. So first of all, we have the Shard Mountains. So this is home to the different various amber that we see in game, and this is where Epic Scups actually ventured towards. Epic Scups went to Thingia with Flutter on an expedition, and this is where we also see that Flutter knows how to go to and from the Prime Reality to Thingia and vice versa. Flutter, our wonderful Flutter, is the creature that you see inside of the ambered thing and the freed thing. Fortunately, it seems as though interdimensional travel, there's some kind of consequence behind it when it's performed in specific ways. As if we venture into the ambered things description, it seems to be hinting towards signs that amber is brought about by the mistravel of things across dimensions, as Flutter is unfortunately emplaced in amber, just like how Kana is, thanks to it adventuring across different dimensions, it seems. There's lots of different theories that you can go into for amber, and we're not going to venture too deep into it, but I'm trying to relate it back to the world tree for the time being. However, with the freed thing, we then see Flutter being able to go from Thingia and back to the Prime Reality with absolutely no consequence at all. So, seeing as though it was also able to help Epic Scups in this situation, it suggests that Flutter has found a way to travel dimensions without this consequence being brought across, or perhaps this consequence is brought across by different means. Unfortunately, this is something I don't really want to go too far deep into today because we've already got so much stuff to go over. For Thingia, besides the Shard Mountains, we also have the Tall Tree. The Tall Tree goes back to those Stablo Mjehurića. We went over with the Thumpiesverse how the different dimensions are influenced by the Stablo Mjehurića, and just like to how the Great Tree was influenced by the Stablo Mjehurića, the Tall Tree is also a consequence of the Stablo Mjehurića, as the Tall Tree was also born from the sap from the Stablo Mjehurića. And then also, besides the Tall Tree, we have the Underneath, which is home to different creatures that you can see on screen from these locations. It's absolutely crazy how little amber sap is able to sprout huge trees inside of these locations, yet also is able to bring about amber in the first place. This relates back to relics. I think that relics are likely a result of sap from the world tree being born, but it's just such an interesting thing, I think, to go over. And then we also have inside of the Thingia dimension the different things. We've got Flutter that we've been over, we've got Shrub, Flappy, Dongle, and Fur too. These all have genders unlike the monsters. So unlike the monsters, with these all having genders, they are very, very different beings, basically. Whether that means that the creatures inhabiting the Underneath inside of the Thingia are also tied to this gender theme, meaning that they have genders too, but we know that the Thumpies don't have a gender, so this is probably just something that is unique to Thingia. With the amber sap sprouting the Tall Tree inside of Thingia and the Great Tree inside of the Thumpiesverse, I think personally that this suggests that the tree can be visited. The actual fact that this sap was able to travel inside of the dimensions suggests that there is a possible way too in which the locations can be traveled across, and that monsters in some way could be able to go to the world tree if they actually tried so. Besides Thingia and the Thumpiesverse, then probably the most complicated dimensions of them all, we also have the Prime Reality, which is our main dimension, which if we pull up our lovely map up here we can see. We have the Pocket Dimension 2 located located to the left, which is pretty much the only location on the world tree we can actually work out, because all of them and the different branches, unfortunately, we know absolutely nothing towards their location. Yet the prime reality's location in reference to the Pocket Dimension is the singular one that we know about, thanks to this map here. I've not put the Pocket Dimension on the map as I think it's very tied to the prime reality, but it is a separate dimension. And then we also have the mirror dimension, which is an alternate timeline of the prime reality where different events may have occurred, but once again, that's something that's probably out of the scope of today's video. And we also have the Prism dimension. The Prism dimension is accessed thanks to the Prism gate, and we've referenced it in many episodes at this point. We've even referenced it in today's episode, I think. Seen as though the Prism dimension is able to be accessed from the Prism gate, it suggests that interdimensional travel is quite a lot easier than what you may be led to believe. And we also know from the Prism dimension that Phosphora came from it, as we explored in episode 3 of the Lore Journals, and it is the home to the globes. Seen as though that the globes couldn't speak, however, it wasn't actually revealed that this was their home dimension, as they had no way of communicating that it was for a very long time. Thanks to the globes, their class is actually revealed to be spectral, and this class is actually not referred to anywhere else in game. This seems to suggest that monsters perhaps do exist inside of the Prism gates, and I think this is something where I would just love to know something more about this, please. The fact that there is an actual class for globes really does throw me out there and make me think that there is monsters from the Prism dimension. That, besides the prismatics that we see emerge from Dawn and Fire, there appears to be actual monsters residing inside of here. So if we could get some more lore, please, on this, I would love that. It's a very trippy area, the Prism dimension, and that's all of the dimensions. That is, besides the Jammerlands. The Jammerlands isn't a dimension though, guys. We do need to go over it though, and this is the perfect time to go over it, I say. The Jammerlands are described to be a Glowl's glide away from Fire Oasis. It's a very large area. We see the astral planes there and various other locations through the game Jammer Splash. And this is where they are all home to. Unfortunately, this is something that we don't really explore inside of the main game, but it's still a part of the prime reality, and I think it's interesting that it's not a part of its own dimension separately, but a part of the prime reality as confirmed by the Fire Oasis description. We also have confirmation that Rare Rebro's telescope can look into all of these different dimensions, so just saying, Rare Rebro, get that telescope out and look into the Prism dimension anytime soon. Anytime now, please. Please do. Oh, I'd love some monsters from the Prism dimension. A Prism dimension island, oh my god, that would be amazing. And we've also got Rare Quarrister, who has all crystals from the different dimensions. That is everything on dimensions, the Stablo Mjehurića, and everything in between. And oh my goodness, guys, I think I overdid myself for this one. It probably did need to be separated into two parts, but I couldn't help myself as it's also integrated with one another, and I knew that I had to put it into one so it could all connect to each other. But honestly, if you've not watched any of the other previous episodes, you probably are confused, so please do go back and watch them, as this is supposed to be a series where you watch them all, otherwise you get confused. The playlist is in the description, guys. But for now, guys, if you enjoyed, please do make sure to leave a like down below and to subscribe too, guys. If we have a look in the journal, our next episode looks as if it's going to be just as big, to be honest.